a man is found zip-tied to a folding chair in his own kitchen, telling police that a masked intruder just killed his wife downstairs. And it sounds like something out of a thriller, a home invader, a struggle a wife shot twice while her husband was, helpless to stop it. There is just one problem. The wife was wearing a Fitbit that morning, and according to that little device on her wrist, she was still walking around the house a full hour after her husband said she was already dead. This case became famous for exactly that reason, because it is one of the first American murder cases where fitness tracker data helped take down a killer's alibi in open court. And this is the murder of Connie Dabate. Connie and Richard Dabate got married on July 4, 2003, and built a life in Ellington, Connecticut, a quiet town outside Hartford in a 4-bedroom colonial house at the end of a long driveway, and to their neighbors they looked like a normal, comfortable family, with 2 boys, RJ and Connor, 9 and 6 years old in December 2015. Connie was 39 and worked as a pharmaceutical sales rep for Reckitt Benckiser, and by most accounts was the one actually paying the bills in that household. While Richard, 40, worked in computer technology, though acquaintances would later describe his career as somewhat rudderless compared to hers. Friends who knew the couple described the marriage the way people usually describe a marriage. They do not actually know much about, calling it happy and normal with the kind of ordinary arguments about money every couple has. What almost none of those friends knew was that Richard had been quietly involved with another woman named Sara Ganzer for years on and off since 2005, and that by the spring of 2015, that relationship had become something much harder to walk away from because Sara was pregnant and the due date was landing right in the middle of what was supposed to be an ordinary Dabate family Christmas. Connie's mother, Cindy Margotto, would later describe her daughter as the glue, holding the household together. The one who managed the money kept the schedule and handled most of the actual parenting, while Richard, by several accounts, leaned on Connie for stability in a way that went well past the ordinary give and take of a marriage. December 23, 2015 was supposed to be an unremarkable Wednesday with the boys at school and Connie facing a normal workday ahead of her, and nobody in that house woke up expecting it to be the last day of her life. Almost every version of that morning comes from Richard himself, and almost none of it holds up. Richard told police he left for work like normal that morning, then realized partway down the road that he had forgotten something at home, either his laptop or a work shirt, depending on which version of his story you are reading. So he turned around and drove back. And when he walked back into the house, he says he heard noise coming from upstairs, and went up to check it out and found a masked man rifling through a closet in the bedroom. According to Richard, the man attacked him and zip-tied him to a chair. And somewhere in the chaos, Connie came home early, unexpectedly, right into the middle of it. And Richard says he screamed for her to run, and instead of running out the door, she ran down into the basement, and the intruder followed her, and there was a struggle, and then 2 gunshots, and Connie was hit once in the head and once in the stomach with a Ruger 357 Magnum revolver. Richard himself had bought 2 months earlier and had never fired. The intruder, Richard said, came back upstairs afterward and did something almost cartoonish, stabbing Richard with a knife and burning him with a torch before simply leaving, and Richard eventually managed to hit the panic button on the home alarm system at 10:05 that morning and called 911 6 minutes later. Police arrived to find exactly what Richard described, from the neck up with him on the kitchen floor, one wrist zip-tied to a folding chair and ankles bound too with only superficial wounds. While downstairs in the basement, Connie was dead shot twice, exactly the way Richard said. So, on paper, in that first hour, everything lined up because a husband tied to a chair does not sound like a killer. It sounds like a victim who got lucky, and responding officers had no immediate reason to treat Richard as anything other than a second victim who had survived something horrifying. And for those first few hours, the working theory inside the department was exactly the one Richard had handed them. That theory did not survive contact with the evidence for very long. Within days, investigators from the Connecticut State Police Major Crimes Unit were already circling back to details that felt off. Because a trained intruder who ties up a witness and leaves him alive to describe every detail of what happened is not how professional home invasions typically go. And there was something else nagging at detectives almost immediately, something that had nothing to do with footprints or fingerprints at all, and it had to do with a small black device Connie had been wearing on her wrist that morning, one that was about to become the single most important piece of evidence in the entire case. K-9 units were also brought in during the initial search of the property, working the grounds around the house for any trace of a stranger having come and gone on foot, and troopers later testified about how those dog searches combined with the total absence of any physical trace of a third person forced their focus back onto the two people who actually lived in that house because there was no trail leading away from the property, no abandoned vehicle nearby, and no sighting from a single neighbor of anyone matching the description Richard gave either before the shooting or after it. Investigators are trained to be skeptical of stories that line up too neatly, and this one had gaps almost immediately, because nobody could explain why a home invader would zip tie a man to a chair and then simply leave him alive as a witness, or why he would stab him, but not seriously hurt him or burn him with a torch. Instead of finishing the job, since none of it matched how an actual intruder behaves, when there is a living witness who can identify him. Then there was the timeline itself. And this is where the case turns into something almost nobody had seen before in a courtroom, because Connie had a Fitbit on her wrist that day, the kind of fitness tracker millions of people wear to count steps, and that little device had been quietly logging her movement the entire morning, completely independent of anything Richard was telling police. According to Richard's version of events, the intruder attacked Connie in the basement sometime around 9:10 or 9:15 that morning, but the Fitbit told a different story entirely, showing Connie still walking around the house, moving between rooms as late as 10:05 that morning, which is nearly an hour after Richard claimed she was already dead on the basement floor. And an hour is not a small gap. It is the difference between a tragedy and a lie. The Fitbit was not the only device quietly contradicting him, because Connie's phone showed activity that morning too, and at 8:58, she sent a Facebook message to a psychotherapist asking to schedule an appointment, saying there was a lot going on right now. And between 9:40 and 9:46, she posted 2 videos to Facebook and messaged a friend. And every one of those actions happened on a phone tied to a timestamp well after the moment Richard said a masked man had already killed her. The home alarm system added its own layer of detail that made the timeline even harder for Richard to explain away, because investigators pulled a full log of every door opening and every zone-triggering motion, cross-referenced against exact timestamps down to the second, and a masked intruder moving through the house should have shown up somewhere in that log too, entering, moving between rooms, and eventually leaving. But what the system actually recorded lined up far more closely with 2 people already inside the house that morning than with any third person ever entering it at all. Investigators also looked closely at the gun itself, the Ruger 357 Magnum Richard said the intruder had used, because it had been purchased by Richard only 2 months before the murder, and according to the evidence presented, at trial had never been fired before that morning, not even for target practice, which struck detectives as an unusual detail for a gun a stranger supposedly brought into the house or found there and used on the fly, since it was a weapon Richard had, bought himself kept in his own home, and it ended up as the murder weapon in a story where he insisted he had never seen the shooter before in his life. There was also the DNA question, because investigators found DNA on the doorknob of the bedroom, the exact spot where Richard said he found the intruder rifling through the closet, and some of it came back unidentified, and his defense would later lean hard on that detail, arguing it proved somebody else really had been in that house, but DNA on a doorknob does not come with a timestamp. and prosecutors would spend years arguing that unidentified DNA proves someone touched a doorknob at some point not. That a killer was standing in that bedroom on December 23rd. Piece by piece, the physical evidence never once backed up an intruder, while 3 separate independent systems, a fitness tracker, a phone, and a home alarm, were all quietly recording a version of that morning that left no room for a masked man at all. Once investigators started pulling at the marriage itself, the picture got a lot less complicated. Because Richard and Sara Ganzer had known each other since junior high school and had brief affairs in 2005, 2007, and 2008. And by May 2015, that relationship had become physical again, and within about a month, Sara was pregnant. Text messages and emails pulled from Richard's own devices painted a detailed picture of a man juggling 2 entirely separate lives for months without either woman fully understanding where the other one actually stood, and investigators found messages where Richard talked to Sara about plans for a future together, while around the same time sending messages to Connie that gave no indication anything in the marriage was seriously at risk, and he told people close to him, according to later. Testimony that he genuinely loved both women and did not want to push either one away. An explanation that struck prosecutors less as confusion and more as a refusal to accept the consequences of the choice he had already made. By December 2015, the math had simply run out, because Sara was due to give birth within weeks, and a divorce meant public embarrassment, a messy custody fight, and the collapse of the image Richard had built for himself and prosecutor Matthew. Gdansky would later put it to the jury in blunt terms, describing Richard as a ticking time bomb, who had painted himself into a corner with no clean way out, and staging a home invasion and becoming a grieving, sympathetic widower solved every one of those problems at once, at least in Richard's mind. Despite the Fitbit data, and despite the contradictions it took, investigators more than a year to actually charge Richard, because he was arrested in April 2017, charged with murder, tampering with evidence, and making false statements to police, and was released on $1 million bond and, remarkably, kept living something close to a normal life, while the case moved slowly toward trial, delayed for years, in part by the COVID pandemic. That 15-month gap between the murder and the arrest reflects just how much work went into building a case around evidence nobody had really used this way before. Because prosecutors were not just gathering data, they were figuring out how to actually present a fitness tracker's internal logs to a jury in a way that would hold up, and a judge held what is called a Porter hearing, specifically to determine whether the Fitbit data was scientifically reliable enough to even be admitted at trial in the first place. And only after that hearing did the evidence become part of the official case. Neighbors who spoke to reporters in the days and weeks after the murder described behavior from Richard that struck them as strange almost immediately, even before anyone had access to the Fitbit data, and one neighbor recalled being texted by Richard, just days after Connie's death, asking casually what everyone's favorite takeout restaurants were, an oddly mundane question from a man who was supposedly still recovering from watching his wife get murdered in front of him just days earlier. The trial finally began in April 2022, running 5 weeks with more than 130 witnesses and over 600 pieces of evidence. And Sara Ganzer took the stand and described the affair in detail, visibly ashamed as she did. It, and on cross-examination, defense attorneys asked her directly whether Richard had ever talked about killing Connie, and she said no. But it did not matter much, because the prosecution's case was never built on Sara claiming Richard confessed to her. It was built on the electronics. Ganzer's testimony filled the better part of a full day in court, as she described meeting Richard back in junior high school, decades of on and off contact between them, and the specific way he kept updating her on the state of his marriage throughout. 2015 always suggesting a divorce was coming without ever actually filing paperwork or moving out, and she testified that once she learned she was pregnant about a month into their renewed physical relationship, she pushed him harder to make a decision. And according to her testimony, his answer never really changed, staying, in her words, always the same talk. Richard testified in his own defense, and his story on the stand had grown even stranger than his original account to police because he now said the intruder's voice sounded like the actor Vin Diesel and that the man had stabbed him even though. Earlier tellings had him burning the intruder with a torch to drive him off, and the story had never once stayed consistent across 2 years of retelling, and juries tend to notice that. On May 10th, 2022, after about 7 hours of deliberation, the jury found Richard Dabate guilty on all 3 counts, and in August that year, he was sentenced to 65 years in prison. The verdict came quickly relative to the length of the trial itself, which speaks to how the jury weighed the evidence once they finally got the case, since 5 weeks of testimony had built toward the same basic conclusion from 3 completely independent directions: the electronics, the physical evidence at the scene, and Richard's own shifting account of what happened, and the jury did not need very long. Once all 3 were laid out side by side to see how little of his story actually held together. Richard did not stop fighting the conviction once he was behind bars because his attorneys appealed, arguing prosecutorial impropriety and pointing to moments during the trial where they said the state's attorney crossed a line, including one exchange, where Richard was asked about a completely unrelated notorious Connecticut crime while he was on the stand. The specific exchange centered on a question the prosecutor asked Richard about whether he had considered killing Connie during an earlier family trip to Vermont. A question his own defense argued had no evidentiary basis and was designed purely to plant a prejudicial idea in jurors' minds rather than elicit any real information. And the defense pointed to 3 other similar moments across the trial, arguing collectively they amounted to the kind of prosecutorial overreach that can taint an otherwise fair proceeding. The Connecticut Supreme Court took the appeal seriously enough to actually agree with part of it, and in a ruling handed down on March 11, 2025, the justices acknowledged that the prosecutor had made real missteps, 4 of them, which the court itself called troubling, and then in a unanimous 6-0 decision, they upheld the conviction anyway, ruling that those missteps had not actually changed the outcome of the trial. The justices reasoned that given the overwhelming weight of the electronic evidence against Richard, the Fitbit data, the phone records, and the alarm system logs, no reasonable jury could have reached a different verdict even without the prosecutor's improper questions. And in other words, the mistakes were real, but they were not the reason Richard Dabate was convicted, because the evidence he could not explain away was. The 65-year sentence stands, and Richard Dabate still maintains his innocence to this day, still insisting a masked man came into his house that morning, and nobody outside of him has ever believed it. Not since a small wearable device that was only ever supposed to count her steps ended up outliving Connie as a witness to what actually happened in that house. What makes this case stick with people is not really the murder itself, since domestic homicides happen constantly and most never make national news. And what makes this one different is how it was solved, because nobody found a smoking gun in the traditional sense. And there was no eyewitness, no confession, and no single dramatic breakthrough. And what broke this case open was a fitness tracker, a Facebook message, and a home alarm system. 3 pieces of technology going about their ordinary business, none of them designed with a murder investigation in mind. All of them quietly recording a truth their owner never got the chance to tell herself. Connie Dabate went to work that morning, sent a message about wanting to talk to a therapist because there was a lot going on, posted a couple of videos to Facebook, and never got to explain what any of that meant, and her own devices ended up speaking for her, instead laying out exactly where she was and when filling in the hour her husband tried to erase. Legal experts have pointed to this case again and again in the years since as a turning point, the moment prosecutors and defense attorneys across the country started taking wearable data seriously as courtroom evidence, including smartwatches' fitness, trackers, and phones that log every movement without anyone thinking twice about it. All of it sitting quietly on people's wrists and in their pockets, building a record nobody asked it to build. Richard Dabate is 48 years old now, serving a 65-year sentence at a Connecticut correctional facility with no real legal avenue left to challenge his conviction after the state's highest court weighed in, and Sara Ganzer has spent the years since raising the daughter she had with Richard. Largely out of the public eye, co-parenting from a distance, most people would find hard to imagine given how her name became attached to all of this, and Connie's family got what they had spent. Nearly 7 years waiting for a jury that believed the evidence over the story, and a small device that never once stopped telling the truth, even after everything else in that house had been staged to hide it.